Okay, for the next section of our meeting today, the idea was that we would hear from three different DevSCA members about their work and potential opportunities for other members of DevSCA to get involved or for us to brainstorm about ways to work together as a community on projects. Because, of course, part of the motivation behind DevSCA's existence is that climate change is a global problem that requires global collaboration. And there are very few opportunities for us to find one another and figure out how to work together. So we want to make these meetings more of a platform to come in contact with one another and learn from each other and maybe begin some of those collaborations that can help move, the science and the practice forward. So our three speakers today are Jorge, Bronwyn, and Pam. And I don't know, actually, I'm forgetting if there was a set order that you three had decided on. No? Then I'm sure someone will be willing to jump in first. And unfortunately, Mary wasn't able to make it and facilitate because she's moving houses and all of her furniture ended up arriving today. So that is why I'm speaking on her behalf. This was really her idea, her initiative. So we can all thank Mary Gavin for this wonderful program. So Jorge, I think you just sent a message that you would be happy to start. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you and maybe you can say just briefly who you are, where you're situated, and then a few minutes about your work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Jorge Cuartas. I am an assistant professor at New York University. I'm also a Colombian, so most of my work is focused in Colombia and Latin America more broadly. So today I'm hoping to share a little bit about the work that I'm doing on climate change and early childhood development. And this is a topic that I'm really interested in for a couple of reasons. The first one is that, as you may have heard already, most children around the world are already exposed to different climate and environmental hazards and shocks. Actually, a study conducted by UNICEF estimates that about 1 billion children, which is 50% of all children in the world, are facing extremely high risk due to exposure to these hazards and climate shocks, in addition to an inadequate access to basic goods and services such as clean water and sanitation. This is particularly consequential in the period of early childhood for a couple of reasons. The first one is that early childhood is a sensitive period of development, so the experiences and contexts that children face are really consequential for their brain development, biological systems, and also for foundational skills that are predictive for lifelong learning, academic outcomes, physical and mental health, economic trajectories, and social outcomes. And despite this importance of early childhood and huge exposure to climate hazards and risks, we know very little about the potential developmental consequences of climate change during these early years. That's why in my work, I have been investing quite a lot in thinking about the theoretical, the conceptual links between climate change, experience early in life, and cognitive, socio-emotional, and motor development across the life course. And in the work that we have been conducting, we identify multiple pathways through which climate change can affect child development at the physical environment, society level, communities, and the family level. With this broad interest in the last couple of months or years, I've been focusing mostly on heat stress or excessive ambient heat as a particular climate hazard, which is basically temperatures that are significantly higher than normal for a given location and season. In theory, excessive heat can be consequential to all of us and overwhelm our biological temperature control systems, causing what is known as heat stress. but this could be particularly harmful for young children, given that their smaller body sizes and underdeveloped biological system may find it more challenging to regulate this heat and deal with heat stress. For this reason, I've been using geocoded, geolocated information, mixing household surveys that include the address, the location of children with satellite data about temperatures. Here you can see an example of Nigeria. The blue dots are individual households, and then in the back, we have the temperatures in different moments of time. With this data, I'm using quasi-experimental approaches, econometrics. I have been conducting different analyses to understand the impacts of heat stress on early childhood development. And what we have found so far is that excessive heat above what is typical in a given region and season can be linked to lower child development scores, even after accounting for these baseline climate conditions. In addition to this, we have also found that these effects tend to be more pronounced in poorer households as compared to wealthier ones, also in urban areas compared to rural areas, and finally in households lacking access to improved water and sanitation. I'm also interested in identifying potential targets for intervention. As a social scientist and developmental psychologist, I'm interested in particular in things that happen in the family system. And in some ongoing research, I'm also finding some evidence that excessive heat can also increase physical punishment and psychological aggression in the family system, which makes a lot of sense, and it's consistent with a lot of evidence that we have on how heat can increase irritability, impulsiveness, and aggression in human beings more broadly. So with all of this, we have growing evidence on how climate hazards, and in particular heat, can affect child development. And looking ahead, I'm really hoping to continue working with DevSCA and all of you in building more evidence, in particular to inform targeted policies, interventions, and advocacy efforts. This is my email. It would be really nice to be in touch with all of you. Thank you very much for the time today.
Thanks so much, Jorge. And it reminds me that something that I meant to say before we started these presentations is that these are part of the idea is that if you're interested in these topics, or you think, oh, maybe there's an opportunity for me or someone I know to collaborate with this person on some particular project, that this is an opportunity to reach out to them and say, hey, maybe we can have a conversation about ways that we could work together. So Jorge, maybe would you be willing to send your email like in the chat? That way everyone has access to it for longer than it was just on the slide. And maybe we have time for just one quick question, because I want to make sure there's time for all presenters as well. And if there are no questions, we can continue with the presentations.
Okay, I can go next. Let me try to share my screen. Let's see. Share. Let me see if I can do screen share, I think. Let me see. Slideshow. Okay, so thank you very much for having me. I'm Pamela Wadende. I am a lecturer at Kisii University in Kenya. And today I just want to talk a little bit about what I've been doing in relation, my projects that are related to climate change. My project have basically been mainly focusing on pastoralist families in remote areas of Kenya, and especially northern Kenya, remote northern Kenya. And I've been focusing on especially the pastoralist Turkana families in this area, because this is the part of Kenya that is currently already feeling the harsh impacts of climate change that are manifested in prolonged droughts, and when the rain comes, there is flooding. And these are pastoralist families that depend on on raising livestock, so they need pasture land. So if there is prolonged drought, the effect is that the livestock die, and there is always fighting over resources, pasture land and water. So these are communities that are already feeling the really harsh impacts of climate change. So I'll talk about this project with these communities, and then maybe two other projects with other communities too that are not in Kenya. So the next slide will just be a little bit about my experience. I have experience conducting research with colleagues in different LMIC settings, urban settings, rural and remote settings. Now, I make a distinction between rural and remote settings because remote settings are mainly characterized by poor infrastructure and poor service. These are, for example, the picture you see around. You find trucks and trucks of hundreds of square kilometers that just look like this, sometimes without roads, no water, and other social amenities. So that is remote. Rural areas could be just a little bit underserved. Urban areas are like towns. So there is a very clear distinction between rural and remote areas. And most times the pastoralist families, they reside in remote areas. So apart from the effect of climate change, the ravages, they are also living in places that are quite underserved. So if there is no rain, they don't have water for their animals. If they were living in other areas, if there would be no rain, they would have piped water for the animals, but it's not the same as where they're living. So the countries where my projects have been are Kenya, Ethiopia, and Cameroon. My current active projects, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Cameroon. I've also had projects in Zambia, but that one is closed. So these are some of the current projects that colleagues and I are working on that are related to climate change, and which, if anyone would be interested, they would get more information and see how to join or how to move them forward. So the first one, surveying indigenous methods of creating peace among the Turkana of northern Kenya, the Amhara of northern and central regions of Ethiopia, and the grassland communities of north and western parts of Cameroon. Now, this is a project inspired by the conflicts that flare up because of the impacts of climate change in these areas, fight for resources. So among the Turkana is fight for pasture land, raiding livestock from each other. When families' livestock gets decimated, maybe they raid livestock from another community. So these are just conflicts that is brought about by resource conflicts, and especially made worse by the ravages of climate change that make the resources scarce. So there is a fight for resources. The other project is examining the levels of mental health literacy among pastoralist Turkana children and adolescents. Now, this was inspired by what we noticed, colleagues and I noticed, that there were very high levels of depression and anxiety disorders among these young Hada youth. Now, this depression and anxiety come about because of the uncertain context in which they live in, where the drought is so prolonged. They are always so worried that their animals are going to die. They are always so anxious that they might not get water in time to water their animals before they die. And then they also witness families that have animals. All of a sudden now they don't have because the drought came and all the animals died. So this living in uncertainty make them have high levels of depression and anxiety. And we noted that it's important that young people should be able to acknowledge, to know, identify that they have a mental health issue before they can get help. So we were looking at this with the hope that we'll have interventions to teach about the symptoms of depression so that people can know when they have depression to seek help. Then the next one that we did was, that is just beginning is collecting young people's perspectives of their future in the times of climate change. What do these people think? Especially the youth in Turkana land and where I live, which is Kericho, that is not so much impacted by climate change. We wanted to compare. What do these young people in a place where they have this effect, and the people who young people in a place that they don't have this? What do they think about their future? What are they optimistic, or these ones who are living in an area where it's impacted by climate change, do they feel helpless, or do they feel they can do something? And there are quite a number of instruments we are going to use to find out more about what their perspectives are for their future. So this is just an image I wanted to show, to just juxtapose with the other images I've been showing of the dry areas. Now, this is the same area that we've seen in the other images. This is a school garden, and I'm glad the first presentation was about school gardens. So this is one school that is making an intervention having a school garden. They have to import soil to have plants in these old tires, old vehicle tires. But what I really just wanted to show is that in this area, when it rains, after a few days, it floods. And when the rain goes, there is drought. So there is always this uncertainty. There is not that sweet spot whereby there is just a little rain and a little sun and enough grass and enough nutrients for the livestock. So this is just that in pictorial form. So I just want to thank you so much for having me, and anyone who'd like to get in contact with me about these, I'll put my email in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Are there any very quick questions, or shall we move to our final presentation? All right, Bronwyn, I think that means it's your turn. I don't know if you have any slides to share. All right, I guess so. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting this great meeting. It's been really wonderful to hear about all the amazing research that's been happening. And I'm here today to talk about one of my research projects that focuses on nature-based education in an urban school district in a post-COVID-19 school closure context. I am an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis with a joint appointment in the Department of Education, the Department of African and African American Studies. I'm also a scholar with the Washington University's Center for the Environment. So I'm glad to be here with you all today. And I have to say, it was really great hearing everyone's stories and how they enter this work, this really impactful, important work. My background is in comparative human development. I trained at the University of Chicago, but I also have a degree in international relations, master's from the University of Chicago as well. But in doing all of that, I always have been involved in getting into the dirt. And so even previous to this work that I'm doing currently, I was actively involved with a local group that was reclaiming abandoned lots and converting them into community gardens in under-resourced communities on the south side of Chicago. And so, hearing some of these stories, especially what's happening at ASU, your work, Moses, just brought back a lot of memories, and using the term magic certainly, I think, applies very strongly. So, in terms of the particular work that I'm going to talk about today, it's operating in a broader context of other research projects that I have underway, one of which is working with a tool that I helped develop, an app-based tool with Bloomberg Connects to provide access and additional insights on urban park. Both its historic, the history of the park, it's an Olmsted Park, but also utilizing it as a tool to inform community members and park visitors about the park's ecosystem as a means of raising awareness of the climate change impacts that are occurring locally, and discussion about the preservation of the tree canopy in the park and those types of things. So that's work that I have going on. I'm happy to talk about that at another time. But for today, knowing there's only so much time to talk, I just wanted to focus on a nature-based program that I am working with as part of my volunteer work with a local nonprofit that advocates and works to preserve and expand park access as a component of healthy communities. And so the research question that motivates this work is, how does nature-based education designed to improve science learning promote positive developmental processes for an urban school district's elementary students who are experiencing COVID-19 learning loss? And so just to give a little bit more information about the program itself, it is designed to provide curriculum-based excursions into 2 natural areas in an urban setting. These excursions are offered at 3 out of the 4 seasons, fall, winter, spring, when school is in session. It is formed as a partnership between a local nonprofit and the state Office for Natural Resources. And so this is a public-private partnership, if you will, but it's really centered around nature-based education and making sure that students are learning about their local ecosystems and climate change effects in the context of science learning standards. So as I mentioned, these program is delivered in 2 sites. One is a 14-acre natural area that was restored through many years of work. It includes a broad nature sanctuary. And the program has recently expanded to a newly restored, please pardon that typo, natural area in a low-resource community that was heavily impacted by COVID losses in terms of excessive mortality rates. The program itself annually serves approximately 750 elementary students, and the majority of those students are qualify for free and reduced lunch, which is a marker of income level. And so these are low-income students primarily who are in attendance, the specific schools that are participating. And many of these communities suffer from lack of access to open green spaces and parks where there can be that exploration of natural areas and the possibility to learn more about their local ecosystem and how climate change is impacting and their lived experiences in their communities, and how they can take steps to ensure that their communities are able to sustain a healthy context for them and their families. So again, context matters, right? And that's the real basis of my work, where I look at strengths-based human development and the human developmental lens as those are related to how educational experiences play out during periods of shock. And as far as this particular program and why it's of interest is because when we think about the shock of the global pandemic, that there was disproportionate impact on under-resourced communities in this particular city that suffered excess mortality rates. There's also work that I've done with Holland Spencer in trying to explore and understand the cultivation of coping skills during shock periods where there's an excessive amount of risk that must be engaged and, if you will, addressed under really, really extreme circumstances where the coping supports simply were not available during COVID-19 pandemic closures, school closures in particular. And Moses spoke a little bit about that earlier as well. And so as part of this work, too, it's important to understand and take into account the fact that the pre-COVID developmental contexts weren't ideal either. That students were going into the COVID school closures already, in many cases, in some of these schools, behind. And so there's this collision of non-ideal learning contexts going into school closures that combined to bring about excessive learning loss that's been documented nationally through the nation's report card here in the US, but also have had particular excessive implications for how to think about locally focused learning loss recovery strategies. And so nature-based learning is another avenue of that. And this particular program is one that is oversubscribed. If anything, they're finding that they're going to need to hire more staff to be able to respond to the demand that they're experiencing from local schools. And indeed, in conducting research here on this particular program, it's important to acknowledge that this is interdisciplinary work and necessitates interdisciplinary collaborations that are occurring across research, policy, and practice domains. Given the nature of this research project being in the context of my work and service with this particular nonprofit, there is a constant interaction with and awareness of the policy and practice needs that inform the delivery of this nature-based program in terms of how to be maximally responsive to the needs of the students and the teachers as those are articulated. And so again, one of the key findings from my research when I was examining the impact of the shock on post-secondary education outcomes and developmental processes as a function of broader identity development processes, is that certainly at the post-secondary level, sustained engagement with educational pursuits were found to be quite supportive of encouraging the cultivation of positive identity development processes and to support coping strategies for students. And so, what I'll be doing with this work is continuing to interrogate that concept in a post-COVID learning loss recovery context through this nature-based program that gets kids outside. This will be a mixed method study that'll be comprised of three main components. The first being an education, the educator and teacher survey. And by the educator, that's referring to the program educator that leads the program. And then also a survey to the teachers that accompany the students for the program. And the teachers are actually the people who sign up for these programs. And so I'll be capturing data from them. The second component is collaborating with the teacher and the educator participants to learn more about the learning objectives and how those are assessed, and to see if those are in fact achieved in terms of the actual science learning objectives and information being shared around the ecosystem found in these two natural areas. And then the third component is, and you can see in this image here, and I have images as you saw throughout, I should have pointed those out, is how the students are making sense of these experiences and what that says about their own developmental processes and identity development in these natural spaces in urban contexts. In one of the visits that I participated in last year as I was developing this research approach, it was amazing how many students had never been in that type of natural environment. And the grade level for this particular visit that I accompanied the lead educator on, those students were in fourth grade. And so really, ultimately, the objectives of this research is multi-pronged, right? Is to learn about how this nature-based learning actually, a program actually does improve science learning about the local ecosystem and climate change education more broadly in the context of this urban setting. It also can help inform policy recommendations for supporting developmental outcomes, strengths-based developmental outcomes for elementary students, as there continues to be struggles with learning loss recovery and coming up with strategies that can possibly be broadened and scaled up into other schools and programs to inform how the nonprofit thinks about, and in consultation with its state partner, expanding this particular program for this particular student population. And also, of course, thinking about how these objectives and the delivery of this program and the results harmonize with Sustainable Development Goals. I should note that, as I mentioned, this research occurs in the context of the research policy practice domain. And so just to close, I wanted to talk about the fact that my research for this particular study is going to sustain an active engagement with how we think about the integration of findings and evidence-based sharing. While we think it can be static, in fact, as this image shows, it can be quite dynamic. And understanding that social science research in the US is undergoing its own shock right now. How do we think about supporting both the researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to ensure that this continued engagement of how to support science learning, climate learning, and learning about ecosystems in urban settings is able to continue? And to close, I just wanted to share an image, a brief video of the experience of being in one of the natural areas and how the students encounter the area. This is actually the area, a pathway within the bird sanctuary. I'd like to just close by sharing that. So thank you very much. And I welcome questions via email, and I look forward to a conversation about this work. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks so much for sharing your work, Bronwyn. It's great to hear about it. I know that we're short on time. Bronwyn, would you mind putting your email in the chat immediately, just so people can note it down before we close out the meeting? I have three very quick points. The first is that people really should feel welcome to contact the wonderful scholars and people who just presented if there's any idea you have about opportunities for collaboration. The second is that if anyone would like to pitch their work and also take advantage of this community to find other people interested in the work that you're doing or brainstorm, then it would be great to know. That way we can have space for you to present in future meetings. So in that case, you can send an email to the DevSCA email account, or I guess more directly to any of the steering committee members would also work. But I can put in the chat the DevSCA email. And finally, I wanted to mention that our next meeting will be on May 29th, featuring Francis Verhunst. So we have another speaker series lined up for May, so we'll certainly send an email about that and a recording of the session today.